Yesterday, Apple announced their brand new iPad Pros with M1 chips, but notably they left one big feature out, and that's the support for desktop applications. Now, notably, the difference between these two product lines has been getting smaller and smaller over the years, starting on the iPad with keyboard, trackpad, and multi-window support, and then most recently on the MacBook Air with support for iPad applications. But it's notable that these two systems still are very, very different in a few key ways. So today we're going to talk through some of the remaining differences between these two product lines, ask whether they make sense, and establish a reason for or against why Apple might merge or eliminate those differences. Let's talk about it. This is InnoISO, and this is What's a Computer? Oh, and by the way, both of these are the 2018 model of the iPad Pro. I'm not going to act like I have the 2021 model before it's released, but we'll go through the big differences and big changes of the 2021 model as we work through this. Starting with the displays. Now, notably the new 2021 iPad Pros, or at least the 12.9 inch, have mini LED displays, which should deepen blacks, increase contrast, and make colors better. It's a great change, but frankly, it's not really a lot for this conversation. The bigger difference that remains between the iPad line and the MacBook line in terms of displays is the touchscreen and 120 Hz refresh rate on the iPad Pros. Up to 120 Hz refresh rate on this means that navigation on it feels incredibly smooth. And that extra sort of smoothness contributes to what generally feels for me like a better browsing experience on the iPad Pro and more reaction when you touch the screen. A higher refresh rate on the MacBook Air would enable for a better gaming experience and a faster browsing experience to an extent. The difference wouldn't be that large when you're just navigating using the mouse. But that leads us into the touchscreen. If you specifically had a touchscreen on the MacBook Air, then the higher refresh rate might be more noticeable. A lot of people have their own opinion on whether a touchscreen makes sense for the MacBook Air. Ergonomically, it might not make sense because you're reaching over a keyboard, but since the MacBook Air now supports iPad apps, the experience of using those applications with a touchpad and keyboard is pretty limited. And so if you specifically purchase a MacBook Air for the sake of using iPad apps, expect a significantly worse experience than just using an iPad Pro, unsurprisingly. Personally, this is one of my biggest frustrations with the MacBook Air because I find it's completely natural to want to reach up and touch the screen whenever I don't want to move a mouse around on a trackpad. If I'm swiping through an article online or just interacting with different elements on the screen, like pressing OK when a menu pops up. Now moving to the design. Now, if we're talking just about laptop use, I would say that the iPad Pro's design, even with the Magic Keyboard, is still incredibly limited. It doesn't feel nearly as natural sitting this on my lap to type as it does with the MacBook Air. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons is the limited amount of viewing angles that you get with the Magic Keyboard. It feels incredibly stiff and uninviting to use the Magic Keyboard as a traditional laptop. It is a lot closer than we've gotten in the past, but it's nowhere near the experience of using the MacBook Air. Just something as simple as opening the laptop from being closed. The MacBook Air is obviously very easy to do so. You always have the one finger lift, which is excellent. The iPad Pro, on the other hand, is more of trying to peel these two sides apart, which is a lot more difficult. The keyboard and trackpad also continue that trend with a very limited keyboard layout on the iPad Pro's Magic Keyboard. Yes, the switches are great, and the experience of typing on it when you're typing an article or something like that is great. But in terms of the functionality, it's severely limited compared to a more traditional computer like the MacBook Air. In my experience, I use shortcut keys all the time for just about every single program that I work in. And the shortcut key experience on that MacBook Air is complete, whereas on the iPad Pro, it's far from it. It's clear that iPadOS is not designed for keyboard input. Even though it's getting closer and closer, it doesn't seem to really react as smooth and effortlessly to the keyboard as a MacBook Air. The same goes for the trackpad. Now, notably, the trackpad on the Magic Keyboard is significantly smaller than the MacBook Air, but even within the operating system, the functionality is quite different. The on-screen cursor in iPadOS is a little bubble that conforms to the shape of any object that it highlights, whereas on MacBook Airs, obviously you get a traditional cursor. This difference is pretty big for me because I don't like the little bubble that you get on iPad Pros, but that could be a personal preference. A few remaining differences. Now, notably, the MacBook has a Touch ID sensor, whereas the iPad Pro has Face ID. Now, personally, I prefer Touch ID just slightly, despite both of these being really fast. More often than not, I'm covering up the sensor on the side for Face ID. In terms of setting these two devices up as desktops with keyboards and trackpads and external monitors, the experience with the iPad Pro is going to get a little bit better because it now supports Thunderbolt in the 2021 model. But that's really not going to clear the gap. One of the biggest differences between these two experiences is the fact that the iPad Pro only really kind of supports external monitors, in that it will mirror the display with the original aspect ratio, and sometimes there is some external content that will appear, but really it's quite a bit worse than the experience using a MacBook Air and being able to display whatever you want on the second display. Now, notably, one of the biggest frustrations that I have with the MacBook Air is the fact that you can't expand to multiple monitors rather than just a single external monitor, which hopefully will be solved in the future, but generally the experience is still a lot better than using an iPad Pro. And you have two Thunderbolt ports on the MacBook Air, whereas you only get one Thunderbolt port on the new iPad Pros, which means that expandability and charging is a little bit more limited on the iPad Pros. The biggest differences between these two product lines really lie in the operating systems themselves. So the software on the iPad Pro is still a lot more restrictive in terms of what you can do with it. Now, notably, more and more applications have been released on the iPad Pro to make it more similar to the experience of using a computer, but using the MacBook Air is just using a computer. One of the biggest reasons why I felt comfortable switching to the MacBook Air was the ability to run legacy applications through Rosetta. That enabled me to not feel like I was being funneled into a specific set of applications, and so I could always run the applications that I was most used to, like, for example, Adobe Premiere Pro. Since Premiere Pro is still working on an ARM version, I still run the x86-based Premiere Pro through Rosetta on the MacBook Air. But obviously, I don't have that option with the iPad Pro. I instead would have to use LumaFusion or some other alternative that's just, it might be similar in functionality, but it wouldn't be in parity. And that's why I came away from the announcement of the iPad Pros yesterday just very disappointed. Because now we know that these two operating systems can run on the exact same SoC or processor. And we know that they have the capabilities to run the same programs. So my question is, why can't you give me the opportunity to run desktop applications on the iPad? Or similarly, why can't you give me a touchscreen on the MacBook Air? There are a few reasons why Apple might not merge these two product lines or eliminate those few differences remaining. Now, one of the biggest reasons that people mention is cannibalization. Apple is supposedly afraid that if they make the MacBook Air touchscreen or if they make the iPad Pro support desktop applications, that then they will be cannibalizing their own product lines and people will not opt for buying both. While I completely understand this logic, I'm not sure I agree with it 100%. Because notably, Apple only has less than a 10% market share in laptops, which means that they have a lot of opportunity to take market share from other manufacturers. Microsoft Surface is a good example. If Microsoft Surface users like me saw that Apple was opting to make touchscreen laptops with an iPad-like interface for touch, it could be enough to get them to come over from their Surface devices and buy MacBooks instead. The same goes for Dell, HP, and Lenovo users that notably still buy touchscreen laptops, despite the Windows 10 operating system really not lending itself to a good touchscreen experience. But that leads us to our next point. Can Apple design a good touchscreen experience on MacBook Airs? Can they bridge these operating systems? Well, Apple is very, very capable when it comes to software, but as we've seen from Microsoft, despite committing to touchscreens over a decade ago, the experience of using a touchscreen on a desktop operating system is not too great. And so it could be difficult or still in process for Apple in order to design that merged operating system that merges both the iPad OS and macOS. It's not going to be an easy task because not a lot of desktop applications really lend themselves to touch experience, and not a lot of iPad apps really work that well with a keyboard and trackpad. it's not just Apple that needs to make the switch, it's all of the developers that make applications for either of these operating systems, which is a massive change that will likely take several years. And then there's the last argument, which is a little bit sketchy. So notably on iPadOS, Apple gets a 30% cut or 15% cut of all applications sold through the App Store. And still, we're in the case where you cannot install any sort of other applications through any other means on iPadOS. Whereas on macOS, you always have the option to install applications via the internet. And so notably, one of the reasons why Apple might not support desktop applications on iPadOS is that then they will be potentially losing the income from the App Store that they are getting for people buying applications through iPad. I'm not sure how much of the App Store revenue is actually derived from iPads. It could be significantly less because there's fewer iPads out there, but notably iPad apps are more expensive often, especially for pro apps, and so it could be a significant chunk of revenue. But it's not clear how much that lost revenue and associated profit would compare to the additional revenue that Apple would gain from selling more iPads. So, perfect example, personally, I would buy an iPad Pro 2021 if it supported desktop applications. And since it doesn't, I'm going to be sticking with older iPads. But what do you think? Do you think these product lines will ever be combined? Do you think we'll see a touchscreen MacBook or an iPad Pro that supports desktop applications? Let me know down in the comments. You should also tell me what you think the biggest reason why Apple would or wouldn't do this. If you haven't already, be sure to get subscribed and check out some of my other videos on MacBook Air, like my experience of trying to add a touchscreen to it. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.